It was late, the kind of night where everything felt like it was about to collapse on you. My shift, which seemed endless, was finally winding down when the radio crackled with a new call. Home invasion. A house out in the middle of nowhere, on a rural road I'd driven down maybe once or twice. One of those houses no one really notices, unless something really strange happens. I sighed, glanced at the clock on the car's dashboard, and figured it was probably another false alarm. Maybe an animal messed with something, or maybe it was just the wind. But the neighbor who called 911 seemed sure they'd seen flashing lights. That was weird, especially for a house that, according to the file, had been vacant for months. The road leading up to the place was long, with no street lights, which made everything feel even more isolated. The radio had been quiet for a while, and I found myself driving almost on autopilot, headlights cutting a tunnel through the trees ahead. At that hour, with exhaustion setting in, every shadow crossing the road seemed more threatening than it probably was. When I reached the house, I parked at the edge of the road. There wasn't much to see from a distance. The dark silhouette of the house against the night sky looked even more rundown than I remembered. The field around it was still, like everything had paused for a moment. I stepped out of the car, and as soon as my foot hit the ground, I felt the weight of the silence. It was the kind of night where your footsteps sounded too loud, echoing in the emptiness. The house wasn't exactly inviting. With all the windows shut, it felt like it was hiding something, or maybe just waiting for someone to make the mistake of getting too close. I approached slowly, my eyes scanning every detail of the weathered facade. The windows were filthy, like no one had touched them in ages. From the outside, everything seemed abandoned. But something didn't feel right. The back door, which I spotted as I walked around the house, was slightly ajar. It was barely open, just enough to put me on edge. The door swayed gently with the wind, making a faint, almost imperceptible sound as I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe an intruder had fled, leaving the door open, or maybe they were still inside, waiting. This was no longer a routine call. The weight of the situation sank in, and I gripped the handle of my flashlight a little tighter. I took another look around. The field surrounding the house appeared empty, but the silence still unnerved me. The trees, tall and dense, loomed over the place, almost as if they were watching every move. I took a deep breath and carefully pushed the door open all the way. The creaking sound was loud, echoing through the house as if announcing my arrival. Inside, the air was thick. The smell of mold and old wood filled the space. My flashlight illuminated the entrance, revealing old furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts from a time long gone. Everything was still, as if time had frozen within those walls. Even so, every detail, every dark corner seemed to be hiding something. I took a few steps inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. Every sound amplified the silence. As I moved through the room, the atmosphere remained cold and motionless, as if it were waiting. Every shadow seemed to stretch beyond the reach of my flashlight, and the tension began to build. There were no clear signs of a break-in aside from that back door. But the house, with its unsettling silence, made me feel that the reason I was there wasn't as simple as it seemed. With every step I took, the house seemed to stretch around me, as if it were adjusting to my presence. I knew it was just a feeling, but it was hard to shake the sense that something was off. The beam of my flashlight caught small details as I moved forward. The old furniture, draped in sheets, looked like figures frozen in time. The floor creaked underfoot, forcing me to tread more carefully, trying not to amplify the noise. Every few meters I stopped and listened. I could hear the faint sound of wind slipping through the grimy windows and the trees swaying outside, but inside, it was just the sound of my own movement. It felt like I was alone, yet my attention was split between every tiny noise. I continued walking through the hallways, opening doors, investigating empty rooms that revealed little more than layers of dust. That's when I noticed something different. One of the windows, which had been closed when I first entered, was now slightly ajar. The cloth draped over the table next to it was gently swaying in the breeze. I knew it wasn't the wind, not with all the doors shut. From that moment, I began to notice more details. Faint marks on the dusty floor, like footprints erased by time, or maybe someone trying not to leave a trail. My body tensed. Something had changed. A sudden sound came from above. It was soft, like a faint rustling, but enough to put me on high alert. The staircase leading to the upper floor was just ahead, and I knew I had to check it out. I gripped the flashlight tightly and started to climb, step by step, the sound of the old wood echoing through the house. Each step seemed to carry me deeper into unfamiliar territory. When I reached the top, everything was quiet again. The light swept across the hallway, but there was nothing there. I kept walking, scanning every corner, but the unease wouldn't fade. Upstairs, everything was just as still as it was downstairs, yet the feeling that something had moved through that space lingered, gnawing at me. As I searched the upstairs, everything seemed to return to normal, but something inside me kept insisting that things weren't right. The faint sound of metal clanging from downstairs made me freeze. It was low, almost muffled, but enough to set my nerves on edge. Without thinking too much, I started down the stairs quickly, trying to stay calm but knowing something was wrong. When I reached the ground floor, the noise had stopped. The room was just as I had left it, still air, furniture covered in sheets. But something was pulling me toward the basement, where the door was slightly ajar. The beam of my flashlight only illuminated part of the stairs leading down into what seemed like an even deeper darkness. I took a deep breath and descended, feeling the temperature drop with each step. The smell of rust and dampness grew stronger as I reached the basement. My flashlight swept over old shelves filled with rusted tools and boxes. And then there it was. An old wrench had fallen to the floor, still swaying slightly as if it had just dropped. For a second I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just time or worn out wood that had given way. But it didn't make sense. The tool had been securely placed on a shelf that shouldn't have just let it fall. The weight of the situation pressed down on me, and one thought filled my mind: I needed to get out of there. I rushed back up the stairs, the sound of my footsteps filling the heavy silence of the house. With every step, my heart raced, and the only thing I could focus on was getting to the front door. When I finally stepped outside into the night air, the sense of relief was immediate, but the unease lingered. I returned to the car, and as I put the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the house one last time. Up on the second floor, the dark windows stared back at me. Did something move? Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I started the car and drove down the deserted road. But the whole way back, one thought wouldn't leave my head. There was something in that house that didn't show itself easily. Even hours later, back at the station, the feeling wouldn't go away. I could still hear the faint sound of metal clanging and see the wrench falling on its own. I knew no matter how hard I tried to forget, that house and that night would stay with me for a long time. I passed by that building on my rounds all the time. Old, abandoned, and more run down with each passing day. Honestly, I never paid much attention to it. It was just another part of the city no one visited, except maybe a few bored teenagers or the occasional homeless person looking for shelter. But that night had a different feel. I can't explain exactly why, but when the call came in over the radio reporting noises at the location, something made me more alert. Maybe it was the operator's tone, a bit more serious, or maybe it was just the late hour. I parked the car and stepped out, feeling the wind cut across my face. The building, which already looked creepy during the day, seemed like a sleeping beast at night. The worn facade, covered in graffiti, looked even darker and more decayed. The broken windows reflected the streetlight in a strange way. It was as if the place was watching, waiting for something. Of course, that was just a feeling. Regardless, I switched off the car's radio and started walking toward the entrance. Doors creaked slowly in the wind, a repetitive sound that was more annoying than alarming. You know that sense of routine? Like, here we go again, as if I were following a script I'd been through before. But something told me this time would be different. With my flashlight in hand, I entered through the main door, which was wide open. No surprise there. The smell of mold hit me instantly. Deep down, I knew this wouldn't be a simple call. After all, abandoned buildings rarely bring good news. As soon as I stepped inside, the silence became even more overwhelming. The only sound was my footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. The beam of my flashlight flickered as I moved forward, revealing the usual scene. broken glass, crumbling walls, and the overpowering smell of mold. So far, nothing new. But you know that feeling when a place seems to hold an untold story? That building had plenty. I kept moving through the corridors, trying to ignore the unease creeping up on me. The floor was coated in a thin layer of dust, except for a few spots where it looked like someone had walked through recently. There were footprints, small ones like someone had been there just minutes before. They led toward a partially open door a little farther down. It was odd. Over the radio, there had been no mention of a break-in, just strange noises. But those footprints, someone had been or still was in there. I tried to focus. It wasn't the first time I'd handled a situation like this. Break-ins at abandoned buildings are common, but something about this one had me on edge. As I got closer to the door, the hallway seemed to narrow, the worn graffiti-covered walls pressing in on me. For a moment, I thought about turning back and calling for backup, but that wasn't how things worked. I reached the door, which was slightly ajar. Carefully, I peeked inside. The room was almost empty, except for a few old boxes and scattered pieces of wood. But on the floor there was a trail of blood. My flashlight illuminated a dark streak that led all the way to the back wall. My heart started pounding a little faster. Something was seriously wrong in there. The blood trail led to something slumped against the back wall. I took a deep breath and moved cautiously, never taking my eyes off what the flashlight was revealing. Each step heightened the sense of urgency, like time was slipping away from me. And when I got close enough, I saw her. A woman leaning against the wall, her face pale and her eyes half open. She was alive, but barely. I knelt down beside her, quickly assessing the situation. There was blood everywhere, especially on her side. It looked like she'd been stabbed multiple times. I tried speaking to her, but all that came out were faint, incomprehensible whispers. I grabbed the radio, calling for backup and an ambulance. This wasn't something I could handle on my own. While I was still trying to stabilize the situation, a muffled sound, barely noticeable, came from the hallway. I turned my head immediately. Footsteps. Quick and uneven, someone was running. The suspect. I jumped to my feet, still clutching the radio, and swung the flashlight toward the corridor. Nothing. But the footsteps continued, growing more distant. I had to act fast. Time was critical and I knew it. I left the woman there, still alive, and bolted toward the door. The sound of the footsteps rose and fell, echoing through the corridors like the building itself was trying to disorient me. I chased the noise, moving faster and faster, sweat beginning to drip down my face. Whoever it was, they were getting away. And I was determined not to let that happen. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I caught sight of a shadow moving quickly ahead. It was him. The suspect. I didn't think twice before sprinting after him. The flashlight bobbed in my hand as I picked up speed, trying not to lose his trail. The sound of my own footsteps and labored breathing filled the space, but I couldn't take my eyes off the silhouette that appeared and disappeared as he rounded corners in the maze of grimy corridors. The building seemed larger on the inside than it looked from the outside, with endless hallways and doors leading to abandoned rooms cluttered with debris. He was fast, but I was gaining on him. Every time he turned a corner, I was closer, almost within reach. Adrenaline pumped through my veins, and all I could think about was catching him, stopping him from getting away. I knew that if he escaped, the chances of finding him again would be slim. He turned one last corner and I was nearly there. When I reached it, my flashlight illuminated the staircase leading to the top floor of the building. There he was, scrambling up the steps as fast as he could. I pushed my legs to keep going, ignoring the exhaustion that was beginning to weigh me down. We climbed 2-3 flights of stairs. The sound of our footsteps echoed through the stairwell, a frantic, pounding rhythm. He was just a few meters ahead. When we reached the top, he turned left, sprinting down a short hallway with a large broken window at the end. I saw him hesitate for a moment, maybe calculating whether he could jump. Then, in one swift motion, he leaped out of the window. I ran to the end of the hallway and looked out. Below there was nothing but empty space. The cold wind hit my face as I stared down at the dark street. There was no sign of him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I glanced around, trying to make sense of where he could have gone. but there was nothing down there except the darkness. He had managed to escape, and I was left standing at the top of the building, a growing sense of frustration washing over me. I stood there for a few seconds by the window trying to process what had just happened. My breathing was still heavy, the exhaustion starting to weigh on my shoulders. I glanced once more at the street below, but there was no sign of movement. He was gone. The criminal I had almost caught had vanished into the night, like a ghost. The sound of ambulance and police sirens drew closer, but it was already too late. I slowly made my way down the stairs, my solitary footsteps now echoing differently, almost oppressively. When I reached the floor where the woman was, the paramedics were already working to stabilize her. She was still alive, but I wasn't sure for how long. I moved closer, but my hands were shaking. As I walked back to my car, an unsettling feeling followed me. The building behind me, the place where it all went down, now felt even emptier, as if it knew the danger had slipped away. I knew he was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, maybe watching, waiting to strike again. The case wasn't closed. And it didn't feel like the end.